The Jewish people in Palestine who believe in and have been working toward this national state have become an immensely proud and determined people. It is already a truly great modern example of the birth of a nation with the primary ingredients of dignity and self-respect. Robert F. Kennedy, 1948. This is a moment in Jewish history. In my last episode, a reference was made to Robert F. Kennedy, and now with his son Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the news, I thought we should explore his writings on Israel. I thought it was important because I was talking to a very knowledgeable person recently who told me they had no idea that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had a famous father who was a senator and ran for president. And that's part of the reason why I do this podcast, because there's just so much history out there, and there's some really interesting and important aspects that are forgotten. Robert F. Kennedy was the younger brother of President John F. Kennedy. He grew up in Boston to a prominent family and attended Harvard University. In the spring of 1948, between his graduation and going to law school, he got a job at the Boston Post, a paper which went out of business in the 1950s. That April, a 22-year-old Bobby Kennedy went to the land of Israel just before the state of Israel was declared independent and the surrounding Arab countries attacked. His 4 news dispatches were published in June by the Boston Post and would have remained forgotten until decades later when author and historian Lenny Ben David of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs discovered them in a yellow brittled newspaper file bounced for the trash. He saved them, transcribed them, and published them on the internet in 1998. Here are some excerpts from his articles. Boston Post, June 3, 1948. Certainly if Arthur Balfour, Britain's foreign minister during the First World War, had realized the conflicting interpretations that were to be placed on his famous declaration calling for a homeland for the Jews, he probably would have drawn it with its meaning clearer and saved the world the bloodshed that its double promises have caused. In his attempt to conciliate both Jews and Arabs in a time of distress for the British Empire, he conciliated neither. First, let us consider the viewpoint of the Arabs in regard to the national homeland promised to the Jews in the Balfour Declaration. The Arabs by word and deed leave no question in anyone's mind how they feel. They argue that the Balfour Declaration supports their point that no national state was promised. They are willing to let the Jews remain as peaceful citizens subject to the rule of the Arab majority, but they are determined that a separate Jewish state will be attacked and attacked until it is finally cut out like an unhealthy abscess. The Jewish people, on the other hand, believe that if it were not for the wars and invasions that racked Palestine and which sent them scattered and persecuted throughout the world, Palestine would be today theirs. It would be theirs just as when Moses led them from Egypt into the Palestinian plains, which they point out were unoccupied except for a few Bedouin tribes. The Jews wish no other country, and in 1903, when Uganda was offered them as a homeland, they were unanimous in their refusal. The Balfour Declaration, when it was made, however, they felt was the answer to their prayers. Under the supposition that, at the finish of the British Mandate, this was to be their national state, they went to work. They set up laboratories where world-famous scientists could study and analyze soils and crops. They changed what was once an arid desert into flourishing olive groves. Soil had to be washed of salt day after day, year after year, before crops could be planted. One can see this work going on in lesser or more advanced stages wherever there are Jewish settlements in Palestine. From a small village of a few thousand inhabitants, Tel Aviv has grown into a most impressive modern metropolis of over 200,000. They have truly done much with what all agreed was very little. The Jews point with pride to the fact that over 500,000 Arabs in the 12 years between 1932 and 1944 came into Palestine to take advantage of living conditions existing in no other Arab state. This is the only country in the Near and Middle East where an Arab middle class is in existence. When I landed at Lida Airport, I carried letters of introduction to both Arabs and Jews, and at the airport, where both sides intermingle, it was explained to me by first one and then the other that I was taking a great risk. The Jews said it was all right for me to carry Arab papers in Jewish territory, for I wouldn't be molested. But when I entered Arab territory, I had better get rid of all letters to Jews, for I would immediately be searched, and if found anything, would quickly be shot. The Arabs said the exact opposite, and I found both to be half right, in that I was never searched by either side. Another fact that I became immediately aware of was the basic hatred of the British by both sides. I talked to a British Army sergeant who had been in Palestine for 2 years, and he placed the blame on the Palestine Colonial Police. Later, I found many to be in agreement. He called them the underpaid, uneducated dregs of society. They were evidently the most corrupt group of police in the world, firstly because they were so underpaid, and secondly because when colonial police were sent to their posts, the worst of the lot were invariably sent to Palestine. Jews received virtually no financial help for building schools and hospitals in Jewish settlements, and the post office, which was set up to serve Tel Aviv, wasn't suitable for a village of several thousand inhabitants. I was forced to wait well over an hour in line in order to purchase stamps. When told if they wanted a port, they would have to build it for themselves. The result was the port of Tel Aviv, which was constructed entirely through Jewish capital and labor. Nevertheless, it is taxed as high as the Arab port of Jaffa, which was built and maintained by funds raised from taxing both Arabs and Jews. Boston Post, June 4th, 1948. I visited and inspected a community farm, kibbutz, through the kindness of a Jew who 40 years ago was in Boston making speeches for my grandfather, John F. Fitzgerald, when he was a candidate for Congress. A third of the agricultural population live in such community farms, which were set up originally to help newly arrived refugees who had no money or prospects. They are in reality self-sustaining states within a state, and all the people in common undergo arduous toil and labor and make great sacrifices in order that their children might become heir to a home. An example of this is that when a child is 1 year old, he is placed in a common nursery, with the result that all but the sick and infirmed are able to devote their talents to the common cause. They get paid nothing, for they need no money. Everything is financed by a group of elected overseers who get their money by selling what the farm produces. In our country, we shrink from such tactics, but in that country, their very lives depend on it. The whole thing is done on a volunteer basis, and one may leave the farm with his proportionate share of wealth at any time he chooses. The one we visited was at Givat Brenner, and although no one paid attention to the firing going on in the plain below, one could see all around preparations being undertaken for the coming fight. I went to the training camp at Netanya, north of Tel Aviv, where for 3 weeks and with very little equipment, Jewish youths, trained mostly by former British officers, were attempting to learn the basic tenets of army life. We watched a first-week group attempt an obstacle course, and while maybe the flesh was weak, it emphasized all the more what can be accomplished when the spirit is willing. We watched a graduation class make its final round, and they gave the appearance that they might well be whipped into a fighting force before much time has passed. I talked to a Haganah officer who fled from Prague as the Germans were taking over the city, and he and his brother, who was killed, fought with the British throughout the war. He received news that his mother and 2 sisters who had left in Prague were killed by the Germans, and that his home had been completely destroyed. Boston Post, June 5th, 1948. I was in Palestine over Easter week, and even then, people knew there was absolutely no chance to preserve peace. They just wanted the British out, so that a decision could be reached either way. An early departure of the British had been far more important strategically to the Jews than to the Arabs. The city of Jerusalem has more Jews than Arabs, but the immediate surrounding territory is predominantly Arab. Through part of that hilly territory winds the narrow road that leads from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It is by this road that the Jewish population within Jerusalem must be supplied, but it is fantastically easy for the Arabs to ambush a convoy as it crawls along the difficult pass. On my trip from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, I saw grim realities of the fact that while in Jerusalem, the failure and destruction of another Jewish convoy made meat non-existent and lengthened food queues for other items. The Arabs living in the old city of Jerusalem have kept the age-old habit of procuring their water from the individual cisterns that exist in almost every home. The Jews, being more educated, an Arab told me that this was their trouble, and now the Jews were going to really pay for it. They had a central water system installed with pipes, bringing fresh hot and cold water. Unfortunately for them, the reservoir is situated in the mountains, and it and the whole pipeline are controlled by the Arabs. The British would not let them cut the water off until after May 15th, but an Arab told me they would not even do it then. First, they would poison it. But in many cases, Jews and Arabs work side by side in the fields and orange groves outside of Tel Aviv. Perhaps these Jews and Arabs are making a greater contribution to the future peace in Palestine than are those who carry guns on both sides. Having been out of the United States for more than 2 months as of the time of this writing, I notice myself more and more conscious of the great heritage and birthright to which we as United States citizens are heirs, and which we have a duty to preserve. A force motivating my writing this paper is that I believe we have failed in this duty, or are in great jeopardy of doing so. The failure is due chiefly to our inability to get the true facts of the policy in which we are partners in Palestine. The British government, in its attitude towards the Jewish population in Palestine, has given ample credence to the suspicion that they are firmly against the establishment of a Jewish state. When I was in Cairo shortly after the blowing up of the Jewish Agency, I talked to a man who held a high position in the Arab League. He had just returned from Palestine, where he had, among other things, interviewed and arranged transportation to Transjordan for the Arab responsible for that Jewish disaster. This Arab told him that after the explosion, upon reaching the British post which separated the Jewish section from a small neutral zone set up in the middle of Jerusalem, he was questioned by the British officers in charge. He quite freely admitted what he had done and was given immediate passage with the remark, "Nice going." Just before I arrived in Palestine, there was the notorious story of the foundry outside Tel Aviv. It was situated in a highly contested area, and the British accused the Jews of using it as a sniper post for the Jaffa-Jerusalem road. One day, the British moved in, stripping the Jews of all arms, and ordered them to clear out within 10 minutes. The British had scarcely departed when a group of armed Arabs moved in, killing or wounding all of the occupants. The British government was most abject in its apologies. I have ridden in Jewish armored car convoys which the British have stopped to inspect for arms. As always, there were members of the Haganah aboard, and they quickly broke down their small arms, passing the pieces among the occupants to conceal them, so as to prevent confiscation. Satisfied that none existed, the convoy, supposedly unarmed, was allowed to pass into Arab territory. If the arms had been found and confiscated and the Arabs attacked, there would have been but a remote chance of survival for any of the occupants. There have been many not as fortunate as we. When I was in Tel Aviv, the Jews informed the British government that 600 Iraqi troops were going to cross into Palestine from Transjordan by the Allenby Bridge on a certain date, and requested that the British take appropriate action to prevent this passage. The troops crossed unmolested. It was impossible for the British to patrol the whole Palestinian border to prevent illegal crossings, but such flagrant violations should have certainly led to some sort of action. 5 weeks ago, I saw several thousand non-Palestinian Arab troops in Palestine, including many of the famed British-trained and equipped Arab legionnaires of King Abdullah. There were also soldiers from Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Transjordan, and they were all proudly pointed out to me by a spokesman of the Arab Higher Committee. He warned me against walking too extensively through Arab districts, as most of the inhabitants there were now foreign troops. Every Arab to whom I talked spoke of the thousands of soldiers massed in the terrible triangle of Nablus to Karem Jenin, and of the hundreds who were pouring in daily. Our government first decided that justice was on the Jewish side in their desire for a homeland, and then it reversed its decision temporarily. If the American people knew the true facts, I am certain a more honest and forthright policy would be substituted for the benefit of all. Robert F. Kennedy went on to serve as United States Attorney General in his brother's cabinet and then elected Senator of New York in 1964. Interestingly, here's an article from the front page of the Jerusalem Post about his election. Friend of Israel is defeated. Republican Kenneth Keating, who lost his Senate seat to Robert Kennedy, is the only friend of Israel to have been defeated in the election. Supporters of Mr. Kennedy said yesterday that he would be in a position to assist Israel. Indeed, when Kennedy ran for President of the United States 4 years later, he pledged support for Israel, as did all the candidates, both Republican and Democrat, although his main issues remained the Vietnam War and social discord. This is Robert Kennedy announcing his candidacy for president in 1968.
I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, between rich and poor, between young and old, in this country and around the rest of the world. I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war.
Yet it was an Arab nationalist who became obsessed with assassinating him. The headline of the Jerusalem Post from June 1968 reads, "Jordanian charged with shooting Robert Kennedy." 24-year-old Sirhan Bishara Sirhan came from an affluent Arab neighborhood of Jerusalem and moved to the United States with his family at the age of 12. Here's what Walter Cronkite of CBS News had to say.
The senator was hit by 2 bullets. 5 other persons were also wounded as bullets sprayed the kitchen. Only the senator was critically hurt. Police later identified the alleged assailant as 24-year-old Sirhan Sirhan, a native Jordanian who came to this country 11 years ago. Sirhan's brother Adel is said to have given the name to police. Fingerprints later confirmed that identification. Among the things discovered in a search of Sirhan's personal effects was a newspaper clipping criticizing Senator Kennedy's support of United States aid to Israel, and a notebook with scribbled lines saying Kennedy must be killed before June 5th. The suspect himself reportedly has refused to talk with police.
To conclude, I would like to end with one more excerpt from Kennedy's 1948 articles. The Jews believe that in a few more years, if a Jewish state is formed, it will be the only stabilizing factor in the Near and Middle East. The Arab world is made up of many disgruntled factions, which would have been at each other's throats long ago if it had not been for the common war against Zionism. The United States and Great Britain before too long a time might well be looking to a Jewish state to preserve a toehold in that part of the world. Both sides still hate the British far more deeply than they hate one another. There was a British High Commissioner who, when attending the opera, used to have his car parked directly in front of the main door, a place usually reserved for discharging passengers. An even more unpopular practice was the regulation that at the end of the opera, everyone had to remain in their seats until the British High Commissioner was out of the opera house and in his car. But the British have left, and now the issue is to be resolved in a bitter war between Jew and Arab. I do not think the freedom-loving nations of the world can stand by and see the sweet water of the River Jordan stained red with the blood of Jews and Arabs. The United States, through the United Nations, must take lead in bringing about peace in the Holy Land. This has been a moment in Jewish history. My name is Ben Bresky, and for questions or comments, you can email me at bbresky@gmail.com or check out my past shows at benbresky.substack.com. Thank you to all the listeners, and shalom.